Hi, fourth grade. It's Mrs. Kite, and today I want to go over day 3 and 4 in your Virginia studies. So last time we looked at the Native Americans timeline, and my slideshow wasn't loading up very well, so I tried to do it from my PDF. Today we're going to read it from the slides because I have all the slides here today. We're going to look closely at the whole timeline. And we're going to look closer at the events that happened right around the Civil War and see how that influenced their feelings about the Civil War. So if we remember back in the 1600s, we're going to go all the way back. December 1606, 3 large ships headed for Virginia from England looking to settle on new land, but over 50 Native American nations already lived all across Virginia. The Native Americans were thriving and did not know what was going to become of their home. In April 1607, Native Americans saw 3 large English ships arrive at their home, and they believed these people would be invaders who took over their land. In May of 1607, about 2 weeks after the first English settlers arrived in Jamestown, Native Americans attacked the English settlers. As a result, the English built the Jamestown fort. 1607 to 1640. For miles and miles, every town along the James River was taken from the Native Americans by force. 1613. Pocahontas was kidnapped by the colonists, married an English settler, and left Virginia to travel to England. Many were sad to see her go because she kept the peace between the Native Americans and the English for many years. 1622 and 1644. Huge attacks were made by Native Americans on English settlements in Virginia, but the population of English settlers just kept growing. 1642 to 1677. The English population of Virginia grew from 8,000 settlers to 40,000 settlers in just 35 years. That's not very much time, guys. Many Virginian leaders were proud that they took over the Native Americans and their territories. 1705. The Slave Code of Virginia is written into law by the government and included unfair rules that Native Americans were forced to follow. 1754 to 1763, so this is the time of the French and Indian War. France and Great Britain began a war over claiming land that actually belonged to the Native Americans, and soon after drew the Native Americans into the fighting. 1775 to 1781, if you recognize that, that is the time of the American Revolution and shortly thereafter. Native Americans are pulled into another war, the American Revolution, and were again divided, fighting on both sides. So here, 1861 to 1865, and we know this is the Civil War era. The Civil War was happening, and as you can imagine, the Native Americans felt they had suffered enough. This time, the Native Americans stayed out of the fighting and remained neutral. Sadly, most of their remaining land was still destroyed, and by 1890, less than 0.01% of Virginia's population was Native American. So now we're going to look at the question. Why do you think the Native Americans wished to remain neutral during the Civil War? You need to write 1 to 2 sentences, complete sentences, to describe what might have influenced their decision. So as you're trying to figure this out, this is the kind of things that you should remember first. All right. What events had led to natives fighting in America? What wars had they been involved in? What happened to their land and their people? Alright, so these are the questions I want you to think about as you're writing those 1 to 2 sentences to describe what might have influenced their decision. The events that led to the natives fighting in America after the settlers arrived. What wars had they been involved in? What happened to their land and their people? So this is something very important to remember. What happened to their land and their people in the time periods after the settlers came. All right, so think about that and you'll be able to answer that question fully. Now let's look at day 4. So day 4, we're going to look at the roles of African Americans during the Civil War. And as you know, African Americans had a huge role to play in the Civil War. We're going to read the roles of African Americans and white Americans during the Civil War to discover how both whites and blacks in the North and South were yet again divided on many issues. We're going to study the Venn diagram. We're going to be sure to notice the difference between how slaves were used as soldiers in the North and how slaves were used to support the war in the South. Then use the information to answer the questions on slide 21 and 22. And we have another optional website. I highly suggest visiting the optionals if you have the time. Roles of African Americans and whites during the Civil War. Although most white Americans in the northern states supported the Union and wanted to end slavery, the white population of Virginia felt very differently. Most white Americans in Virginia supported the Confederacy during the war. They fought to keep their slaves, they wanted to protect their farms, and they wanted to win. But what roles did the free African Americans and slaves play during the war, especially after Abraham Lincoln freed all the slaves in the southern states with the Emancipation Proclamation? We're going to examine the Venn diagram on the next slide and answer the questions. So over here we have the slaves of the Union in the North. So, northern free African Americans, many blacks were drawn to fight because of the promise of freedom if they helped win the war. The Union Army and Navy welcomed the support of newly freed slaves who left the South and began to train them for combat. Black Union troops quickly earned reputations for showing bravery and being fearless fighters. Now let's look at the slaves of the Confederacy in the South. The Confederacy forced blacks to grow corn and raise cattle to feed the white American soldiers. Slaves also worked in factories and kept railroads running. Others were body servants and forced to follow their masters to war. Slaves were only welcome on the battlefront to transport supplies, cook meals, and build forts. They were not allowed to fight because the Confederate soldiers feared that slaves would turn their weapons on them. Badly losing the war, Robert E. Lee was desperate and finally convinced Southern leaders to allow slaves to help them fight, but it was too late. The South lost the war only a few weeks later. And what they had in common here is that African Americans wanted freedom. And remember this, on both sides, they wanted freedom. Questions part 1. Why did so many slaves join the Union Army and Union Navy? All right, and we're going to remember the Emancipation Proclamation when we answer this. Why do you think some slaves worked for the Confederacy, the South? So study the southern side, study the right side of the Venn diagram to help. List at least 3 things that slaves in the South were forced to be responsible for during the Civil War. So, right here, if we look at that first paragraph in the red circle, then we should be able to answer that. So I'm going to go ahead and put that down. First paragraph in the red circle. So that's where you're going to find your answer. How do you think the slaves felt about being forced to support the Confederacy? Explain why. So here you're going to read the red circle again. And think about how that would feel. All right, I have faith in you guys for being able to answer these. Make sure you answer them in complete sentences and send these to your teacher at the end of the week. All right, good job, guys. It's been a blast, 4th grade, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.